Okay, hi everyone. My name is Kevin Butterfield. I'm the director of the John W. Kluge Center here at the Library of Congress. My great pleasure to welcome you to today's events and also all of those who are joining us online for this fascinating conversation about the book Saving Ourselves, written by Dana Fisher. We're joined on my far left, by Darna Noor, a fossil fuels and climate reporter at The Guardian. She previously covered that beat for the Boston Globe, writes about some of the same issues that Dana Fisher has explored in this book that we'll be discussing today. Dana Fisher, by the way, is the director of the Center for Environment, Community, and Equity and a professor in the School of International Service at American University. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Let's dive into the book. This is a study and a great look at climate activism, where we are now and where you imagine we might be heading. One of the things that I'm curious to explore with the both of you is kind of the landscape of climate activism today. 2024, where are we? And I want to start with the big question about awareness. What's your sense, Dana, based on your research, and Darna, based on your reporting, I'll start with Dana, of popular awareness of the potential disasters of a warming climate, popular awareness of this as a problem, both domestically and internationally?
It's a very big question. I mean, basically, I think that at this point, we know that many people are becoming increasingly concerned about climate change. And part of that is due to the fact that many people are starting to experience the climate crisis personally and firsthand through the experience of what we call climate shocks, which are deviations from normal weather patterns that are due to it, or exacerbated by concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And the situation is kind of interesting because while people are becoming increasingly concerned, and that's growing in areas where people have experienced climate shocks, at the same time, there is a lot of greenwashing and a lot of confusion being promoted so that many people don't understand exactly how concentrations of greenhouse gases are associated with these climate shocks or the increased warming. So that's muddied the waters, shall we say. And it's interesting because it depends on some research that has documented really nicely how it depends on what sources of media you follow, what you understand and what you don't understand, and where you question things. And so as we have a more polarized media landscape and political landscape, we see much more variation in opinions about this. And that happens actually not just in the United States, although it is very pronounced here in the United States. It's happening in many countries, particularly countries that do produce fossil fuels. So we've documented something similar in the UK, in Australia, in Canada, for example.
Greenwashing was the term you used. Could you flesh that out?
Yeah, so I mean, some people call it climate misinformation, but I was just using a nicer term of greenwashing. But basically, greenwashing is talking through and kind of obfuscating the scientific evidence that exists so far about the ways that fossil fuel extraction and burning is associated with higher concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which is associated with warming as well as climate shocks and extreme events.
Darna, what's your reporting say about the awareness of climate as a problem?
Thanks for having us, first of all. Definitely agree that I think, while awareness is increasing, greenwashing is on the rise as well. And I think there's quite a lot of evidence that, raising awareness itself doesn't really solve the problem. It does create the conditions for a more sort of energized polis to get involved in these issues and to try to make change. But also, if we talk about the people who were the most aware of the climate crisis for the longest, really, we can look back to fossil fuel executives and the scientists who worked for the fossil fuel industry, who we now have lots of evidence, and as Dana's book sort of discusses also, knew about the dangers of burning fossil fuels and the sort of warming effects of burning fossil fuels for decades and decades, and chose to cover that information up. And I think that while we're seeing more sort of outrage, more concern, more freaking out essentially about the climate crisis, we're also seeing that people are being fed a lot more information that's sort of designed to assuage their fears in many ways. One thing that I'm thinking of, for instance, that Dana's book also discusses is the usage of the term natural gas. At the Globe, at the Boston Globe, where I previously was a reporter, I can't tell you how frequently I would hear from people who would say, oh, you write so much about the dangers of methane, you say that methane is increasing, but we're not using methane here in Boston, we're using natural gas. Well, natural gas is an industry term potentially for methane gas. Methane is a greenhouse gas that is 80 times more planet warming than carbon dioxide in the near term. And so I think, what we're seeing is, yes, a lot of sort of potential for awareness to turn into something, but I think as the book shows, awareness itself is not, it's not going to fix the problem.
Let's talk about another aspect that I see it all the time on the front page coverage of these kinds of questions. That is attempts for governments and international agreements to grapple with the problem. And your book you use the phrase international climate regime, I think a few times in the book. I'm interested to think about that with you. These are negotiations often. It kind of seems to take the form of nations coming together, the Paris Agreement, the Kyoto Protocol. Could you talk to me just your sense of the last few decades of the international climate conversation, where we are?
Well, so the international climate regime was born in 1992 at the Earth Summit in Rio, and that was with what's called the Framework Convention on Climate Change. We use the term, the climate regime is actually a formal term to refer to all of the institutional arrangements that exist for this policymaking process, and that is the international governing body, the subsidiary bodies, and all the parties, which are the nation states and their representatives who come together with the hope of passing climate policy. So the UNFCCC was the first international treaty that was aiming to start to address the climate crisis, although we didn't call it that back then, and that was purely voluntary, so it wasn't very effective. And since then, we're moving towards our 29th meeting, Conference of the Parties. The Conference of the Parties is the meeting of the bodies involved in the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was started in '92. So we are 28 and a half years down the road, and we've gone through the UNFCCC, the Kyoto Protocol, which is what I did my dissertation on and wrote my first book on many years ago. And now we have the Paris Agreement, and none of those have been effective in actually addressing the climate crisis at the level it's needed. And one of the ways that we can see that is if you look at charts of carbon concentrations in the atmosphere, they continue to keep going up quite consistently.
Darna, your sense of the international conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more, and I think it's just fact, it's just a kind of scientifically agreed upon fact that none of these agreements have delivered the kind of change that actually meets the scale of the crisis. And one reason for that is that they're not really binding, and part of the reason they're not binding is because rich countries that produce a lot of fossil fuels, are able to essentially change the rules of the game at these international climate talks when it's convenient for them to do so. The book also discusses another really big issue with these international climate talks, which is that the fox is very much in the hen house. Every year we see these reports from the folks at Corporate Accountability, which is a nonprofit that sort of works on the sort of oil industry accountability and related issues. We see an increasing number every year of fossil fuel executives and lobbyists who are kind of participating in these talks, and often are privy to the level of negotiations that civil society and that activists are not privy to. And so I think that we're seeing really sort of important structural issues that are real impediments to actually getting anything done at these negotiations.
Actually, let me just add in here that I think that Darna makes some really important points. So back in the early aughts, I actually did a project comparing different international regimes, one around development and one around climate change. And at the time, we actually identified the climate regime as one of the most transparent and open to NGO participation and most transparent to general civil society understanding what was going on around the climate negotiations, around that negotiation process. And that process has completely changed. So not only has the regime closed the doors and made it much harder for civil society and NGO observers to participate, and now if you go to any of these rounds in the negotiations, civil society has to meet separately. But in addition to that, I would say the mask is off, and all the fossil fuel interests that used to come in under the guise of these NGO observers that were bought and sold by business interests that were associated with fossil fuels are now just there. So for example, at COP28, OPEC had their own tent because, why even hide it? They're there. And and the other place that we see that I think is really worth noting is, so I contributed the most recent assessment of the IPCC, and as an author there, we did the work, and then when we were working through the summary for policymakers, we were required to take the term fossil fuel interests out of the report in the summary for policymakers, and we had to call them vested interests. And that was absolutely pushed for by fossil fuel interests who did not want the science that is absolutely certain about the role that they're playing in the climate crisis to be named so clearly.
While there's an apocalyptic element to the work that we're talking about here today, Dana's book, Saving Ourselves. Both in the book and elsewhere have used the phrase apocalyptic optimism. Let me try to touch or pursue a question that might lead to a bit of optimism. Is there anything in the institutional responses, whether nationally, particular governments, or internationally, that has been successful? Do you see any bright lights in the institutional responses to these challenges, or are they hard for you to find?
Well, I mean, so as I talk about in the book, so I've been studying climate policy making for 25 years now, since Kyoto, and unfortunately, when we look at and assess institutional responses, they are absolutely insufficient. So there's not a lot of bright light there, which is why I call myself an apocalyptic optimist. I'm an apocalyptic optimist because I do believe that there's hope, but I do not believe that there is hope coming from business interests or from political interests at this point, at least not at the national or international level, perhaps at the subnational level. And instead, the way that I see the most likely way through the climate crisis is by increasing experiences of climate shocks that mobilize individual citizens to collectively take action and rise up. And that is where we have this glimmer of hope. But it's not from the states the way the states are arranged right now.
Let's bring another party in to the conversation, or groups of parties, and that's what can be called the big greens. That is the big advocacy organizations, the lobbying organizations, grassroots organizing. I'm thinking of groups like Greenpeace, Sierra Club. Where do they fit into the story?
Well, so these are civil society organizations, or they're social movement organizations, depending on what field of the social sciences you work in, right? But these big greens are basically highly professionalized organizations that are working to advocate around climate, or around environment generally, right? And climate has become one of the central organizing themes that they work on. But what's very interesting about the big greens is that they're quite professionalized at this point, and professionalized meaning that they have formal staff, they have budgets, they have members, they have requirements about how many funds they have to bring in, or else they have to lay off people like they just had to do at the Sierra Club recently. And these groups tend to be much closer or more closely aligned to policymakers than these less organized and less institutionalized parts of civil society. And one of the things that I talk about in the book is the way that big greens have really pushed to support and get behind President Biden and the Biden administration very early on, which is not a consistent way that a non-state actor tends to engage in electoral politics. If you study electoral politics in the United States, usually these groups, like for example unions, wait to decide how they're going to support and who they're going to endorse in an election. But the big greens came out early, a number of them, and endorsed the Biden administration to run for a second office early on, before ever asking for anything. And while they were doing that, there were a number of climate activists who were also part of the study that were protesting outside because they didn't feel like the actions that had been taken so far were sufficient to address the climate crisis.
Dana, you've been covering in this space. What's your sense of the big green, these actors like Greenpeace and Sierra Club? How is their work succeeding or failing to succeed in the struggle?
You know, I think I agree that it's pretty notable that many of these organizations have come out early on to endorse a president that they have also critiqued so heavily. I think that kind of might show us quite a bit about how these groups interface with people who are in power. And you know, I think that many of these groups are sort of taking strides toward centering more grassroots communities. You know, communities that might not have traditionally had the ears of those in the halls of power. And I think that we're seeing, frankly, that creating quite a lot of tension within these groups. It's really difficult, I think, to speak to people who are most affected while you're also kind of from the get-go making compromises to ensure that you have access to, you know, power brokers. And so, you know, I don't really have an opinion on which side of this is correct or not. I think it's just it's difficult to do both at the same time, and I think that's a struggle that we're seeing play out right now, as the book makes clear as well. One
of the leading figures in this, and as I've been watching this unfold over the last decade, not in great detail that you two have, but Greta Thunberg is a remarkably powerful activist and advocate. And in October of 2022, you quote her in the book, Dana, as having said this. Let me read it, and it's, I think, a powerful touch point that we can build off of. "We have to abandon the idea that the people in power will come to our rescue," she said. "The people in power have proved that they are not going to be the ones leading this change, not without massive public pressure from the outside. We have to be that pressure." Now, of course, you know the context where this is coming from. Could you fill in the context of where this comment was derived and help us understand what she's getting at?
Well, I mean, what basically Greta Thunberg is talking about is the fact that initially when she started skipping school, so just so we're all on the same page here, Greta started skipping school and started Fridays for Future in 2019, and it's always, no, maybe it was August 2018, okay, well. So it was a while ago, and when she did, she started skipping school and sitting outside the Parliament on Fridays. This is why Fridays for Future is called Fridays for Future, with her cardboard sign, which she did sail the sea and come here to the United States and came here to DC, gave congressional testimony, I believe over there, during 2019 as well. And what is worth noting here is that initially, I believe that Greta thought that if she empowered and helped to speak for a large enough movement of young people, that power would listen to her and listen to the concerns. And so these were young people who had decided that they were going to take time off of school, skip school because the crisis was so severe that they had to do something about it. And so they were taking time off of school, they got a lot of attention, and then they also were invited to, there was a whole youth summit component to the UN meeting that year. And Greta addressed the UN summit. She addressed the World Economic Forum. She came here and addressed the Congress. And I believe that she really felt like people were going to listen to her. And over time, she got very frustrated with that and got frustrated with the incremental politics, which was the only politics that was possible, which basically meant that there were so many compromises made that the world was nowhere closer to addressing the climate crisis than it was when she started skipping school in the first place. And so when she speaks about this, she has more recently started taking a more confrontational turn in her activism, and it has been engaging in civil disobedience, nonviolent civil disobedience, and has gotten arrested engaging in actions all over Europe at this point, and actually was just on trial for it recently. And that's because she's so frustrated, and that's where that message comes from.
You mentioned the phrase nonviolence, and I will come back to this, I'm sure, and the questions which we'll come to shortly as well may take us there as well. But that is the long history of activism, more broadly defined, not just climate activism, but activism broadly defined. This kind of civil disobedience and nonviolence, where do you see a historical arc that can connect climate activism to our past?
That's a great question.
Is it too big? Feel free to
No,
narrow
it's
it
great.
down.
I have a piece on what the climate movement can learn from the civil rights movement that's about to come out. So I've been thinking a lot about this. And so what we know about social movements, and my orientation is I'm a sociologist who studies social movements. So what we know about social movements is that when people want to affect social change, they work together collectively to try to push for social change. And the longer they do that, they usually start out working more institutionally through the channels of power and where they have access to power, letter writing, electoral politics, et cetera, and so forth, to affect change. But as social movements go on in time, there are two options. One option is that they demobilize and they give up because they're not going to achieve their goals. And there are examples of failed social movements like that. The climate crisis, the climate movement is not one of those, because the climate crisis is getting worse. People are personally experiencing firsthand how climate shocks are affecting them and are seeing it. It's February. We have flowers blooming outside here in Washington, D.C. It's 68 today. I mean, and I realize this is a deviation today, but nonetheless, if you look at trends, we just experienced the hottest February ever on record. The oceans are warm, the glaciers are melting. I mean, there's not a lot of good news here. And within that context, we have to think about, where we need to go and how we're going to get there. I mean, actually, I didn't.
The longer historical.
Sorry. So as a result of that, people are not going to give up. That was my point. So if that happens, research tells us, and if you look at other social movements, what we know is that people tend to organize into these kind of flanks of movements called the radical flank. And in it, you end up with components of a movement that are taking more radical tactics. And these radical tactics, I should just say, start out quite benign. And for as many people as do not like to see people throwing soup on coatings of paintings, these are examples of relatively benign nonviolent civil disobedience, or blocking buildings, or using crazy glue. And radical flanks tend to help to push both for more attention to a movement and also more attention and support for the more moderate flanks of the movement, which is what we see in the climate movement. But we also saw that during the civil rights movement, during women's suffrage, et cetera, and so forth. But what we do know from the civil rights movement and women's suffrage and other previous movements is that the longer a radical flank exists, the more likely it is that we will see violence, not just nonviolence. And, and I'll stop there.
Let me ask you one more question, and then I want Darna to flesh out to her sense of the demographics of the climate activism that we see today. So we've mentioned the world famous young Greta. Is she representative? Does she help us have a glimpse into climate activism today? Are these all young idealists, or how much more diverse is this landscape? Because you've been studying it in detail for however many years, you can tell us.
For 20-some years. So one of the things that I do is I survey protesters. So I actually get the demographics of the people who are in the streets. And that's a lot of the data that went into the book came from those data plus interviews with activists. So what's interesting, there is no generic climate activist, right? Around the world, there are people all over the world who are mobilizing around the climate crisis right now. Many of them don't look like Greta. And they don't look like Greta because many of them are not young, but many of them are not white and they're not privileged, and they're working in communities and countries that are facing the dire consequences of the climate crisis right now, because unfortunately the climate crisis is not hitting the world equally, right? So some countries are sinking and some countries are having to face, climate refugees, et cetera, and so forth. But what I would just say, in terms of in the United States, what we know about climate activists is that those people who are most mobilized around just climate change specifically and come out for these kinds of events tend to be highly educated, predominantly white, and right now we know that there's a relatively bimodal distribution for age. That means that we see a lot of young people and we see a lot of people who are older. But that's also because the climate movement right now is not very large, and when we see less mobilized periods of time when activists are engaged, what we end up seeing then is the people who have the time. And the people who have the time are the older people and the younger people who always engage. And we've seen this in other movements before it. So it's quite classic, but what happens as movements move on is you have more mass mobilization and then you fill out the middle. One of the questions is the degree to which we'll see solidarity across movements, and then we'll see people from frontline communities and communities of color joining right now with the climate movement, or joining in the future, because right now we do not see that as much.
Darna, you probably have attended marches and protests as well, and have been covering this for some time. What's your sense of the demographics of the climate activism community, for lack of a better word?
Sure. Well, Dana's the expert on the demographics question. Having covered this with such a close lens for so many years. But a sort of trend that I've been really interested to see too is that other movements have really gotten involved in the sort of climate space, whether or not they use that term. I'm thinking, for instance, of a few years ago, there were these massive protests across India, and especially in the north of India and Punjab, where my family's actually from, where farmers were protesting conditions that had led to increased privatization and therefore increased prices of the seeds that they were using, essentially to make their own livelihoods, really the agriculture that's the foundation of many village communities. And many of them were not using the term climate change, but many of them were kind of taking to the streets and saying that this is a particularly important movement because agriculture is not just facing the threat of sort of private capital, it's also facing the threat, which is closely linked, of increasing temperatures, less rain, much more erratic weather patterns. That itself was a climate movement in some sense, and I think that Dana's right in saying that much of the question now is how much the sort of climate movement, capital C, capital M in the United States and elsewhere will sort of take up the mantle that's created by some of these other sort of seen to be unrelated groups. Another really important trend I think we're seeing is that unions in the United States are, again, sometimes not using the term climate change, but sometimes they are, to really try to make strides that will affect the fight for a livable future and the fight for a really just sort of new green economy. So the UAW, for instance, the United Auto Workers, is trying really hard to unionize all electric vehicle workers, which is something that we really do not have very much of in the United States, is union protections for those in the sort of EV economy. So again, I think that the solidarity question is really important, and I think that that needs to work in both ways. You know, we need other sort of movements to take stock of the climate question, but we also need the climate movement to sort of take stock of where other movements are at and really uplift those as well.
Dana, you did a lot of the preparation for this book while in residence at the Kluge Center here at the Library of Congress. In fact, you've told me that you did some of the coding of your survey work in the main reading room, just steps away from here. Some of that coding would have helped you get to the bottom of what kinds of things the climate activists believe, kind of their attitudes towards these questions. And we talked a lot about substantive things, but there's a bigger question of, for lack of a better word, optimism versus pessimism. That is, is this a hopeful activism or a fearful one? What's your sense?
Well, so I would just say, so when I was here on the Kluge Center, I actually was coding my interview transcripts, because I worked from hundreds of interviews that I had done with climate policymakers as well as climate activists over, basically this book is in a lot of ways bringing together data that I've collected for the past 25 years. So I went through and back through all of these to try to understand how things have changed and the way people are talking about the climate crisis changed based on where they situate themselves in the institutional arrangements, you know, whether they're part of the state, they're part of businesses, or they're civil society actors. And coming out of that and doing that in the beautiful reading room here, it became clear to me I had to do more interviews. And so I ended up doing more interviews as part of the time that I had here. And you know, this question about optimism and pessimism is an interesting one, but I actually would frame it really differently. And what I would say here is that there's been a lot of discussion recently about how there's climate doomerism, and some people are feeling such climate anxiety that they are potentially not going to engage and not going to help to bring us to a better world or a more sustainable world. And I wanted to ask that question. I was curious about it. And so when there was a protest called before the UN meeting here in the United States this past fall in September, I decided to add questions to my survey that specifically asked about this to test it, because the data, we didn't have data on the people who were actually mobilizing. Were they feeling anxiety? Were they the most hopeful people? And so I wanted to go out and ask that. So we actually went out and did a random sample of people who were participating in the March to End Fossil Fuels last fall. And one of the things that we found that was quite interesting in contrast to this, these claims, is that the people who were actually participating in activism around climate change were people who said that their top emotions that they were feeling about climate change were anger and depression. Which is interesting, because that is flying in the face of those who say that actually those people are not likely to participate because they're going to be despondent, they're going to just give up, right? Which means that in some ways the anger, and many of them also reported, 86% of them reported experiencing wildfires, because we had smoke all over, you know, the Northeast and beyond last summer. They experienced the effects of the climate crisis firsthand, and it actually got them to feel angry. So they were, I mean, I'm not sure if they're optimistic or pessimistic, but they had, well, you know, what we asked them is about their sense of efficacy, and they felt like they had something they could do, and what it was taking to the streets and mobilizing and working together. And it was because of these emotions and these experiences. And when we looked at data that we collected with a general, you know, a sample of the general public, we find that the emotions are much stronger for the people who are participating in activism. And also, what I think is kind of interesting is that the people who are not engaging in activism are much more hopeful.
Wow.
So.
You mentioned taking to the streets, and there I'm thinking of marching and holding signs, but your book also really does go into great detail about something that you think is, you project is going to grow in the future, and that's a changing tactic towards what you described earlier as a radical flank, the radical flanks approach of more confrontational, more direct, and well, I want you to flesh out for me, what should we be anticipating in changing tactics? What are you seeing now? What do you anticipate for the future?
Well, I think at this point, everybody knows that there are some climate activists who have used crazy glue in innovative ways. And we also have seen climate activists throw food. I mean, one of the things that those of us who study social movements know is that these tactics have to innovate and change, because otherwise they do not achieve their goals. And this type of activism, which is what I call these people shockers, because they are engaging in shock to gain media attention. and to get general attention for the issue. But we know that the more you throw soup, the less likely people are to pay attention, right? And so I did this interview after the Mona Lisa toss a couple weeks ago, and I said, well, where else can you throw soup at this point and get attention? And so there's going to have to be what we call tactical innovation, where the activists are going to have to move to something else. But what we do know they will do is they will do something that gains attention, that will be media worthy, and it will be disruptive. And I don't mean disruptive in terms of like people feeling worried about their personal lives, but disruptive in terms of it causing a disruption perhaps to your daily life. For example, I mean, so last summer we saw there was the tennis open here in DC. There were activists who came in and did a banner drop. And nobody knows about this unless you were actually there, or the activists had talked to me about it ahead of time. Nobody knew about it. A couple weeks later at the US Open, activists did the exact same thing, except for one of the activists, who I was lucky enough to meet in New York 2 weeks ago, put crazy glue all over sorry, I was so loud there. Put crazy glue all over the bottom of his foot, his bare foot, and he glued himself to the stand. So he stuck himself there. And because of that, they had to pause the action. They did a banner drop, but it was much harder to get rid of them, and they had to do this whole process, which is very painful, by the way, to take off all the bottom of the skin on the bottom of your foot. But they had to pause the play, and they got a ton of media attention. And it was interesting to me because then I, of course, whenever this stuff happens, I get calls from the media, and I was asked to do TMZ Live, which I've never done before. And they wanted to talk to me about these people and why they're disrupting sports. And they said, you know, it's not working, is it, Dana? And I said, but I'm on TMZ Live talking about climate activism, which I never thought I would do. And I never thought that was something that would ever happen and I would ever get to talk about my new book here, but I am, and I'm only doing it because this one guy decided to crazy glue his foot. And it was that tactic. So it does tend to work. And what it does that's actually really important, and we know this from lots and lots of research, is that the people will watch that. And most of them won't be there, but they'll see it and they'll hear about it in the news. And they'll say, you know, I don't like that they did that. And it's very unpopular. It was very unpopular during the civil rights movement too. But I do think that climate change is a problem, and I want to do something. And they will go and they will support more moderate organizations, and that is how the movement expands. And so we should expect to see more of that. But I do not think that people should be worried that it's going to be crazy glue or food being thrown in museums. It's going to be something different because it constantly has to change to get attention.
Wow. And since you mentioned something being media worthy multiple times, Darna, your thoughts on this? Have you seen firsthand, or do you anticipate seeing tactics that Dana hasn't yet described?
I think that more these what you call the sort of radical flank, these tactics are definitely gaining visibility as they're being used more. Interestingly, I think that there's also an emergence of the sort of more polite institutional tactics that I think could also lead to some pretty big changes. And I think that we're seeing these sort of emergent strategies come to life at the same time. You know, for instance, I write a series at The Guardian called Big Oil Uncovered that follows lawsuits that are taking on the fossil fuel industry. We've seen so many more lawsuits that are waged against big oil, that are waged against governments for sort of pro-fossil fuel policies emerge in the past 5 years, and really so many more even just in the past 2 years. And we saw a big victory when kids sued the government of Montana last year. And to hear you say it, Dana, I think that, you know, the sort of emergence of this more radical flank of tactics will also lead to more of that sort of fight for institutional change too. So, you know, I think we are seeing tactics change, but frankly, we're also just seeing more tactics. As more and more people are getting involved, more and more people are getting concerned, people are realizing that they can be creative and sort of use whatever venue is available to them to try to make that change.
So Darna, as a reporter who covers this beat for The Guardian, and this is a social movement, and you have a leading scholar of that social movement, what questions would you want to bring to Dana after having had a chance to read her book, which I believe we both have read it. Many of us have not, but the two of us have.
Yeah, I have.
What questions come to your mind?
Yeah, totally. I would really recommend that all of you read it as well. I was very glad to get to. You know, your book, Dana, focuses a lot on changes that come from risk and the perception of risk, the increasing real and perceived risk of the climate crisis. But we've also heard in the past few years about the sort of opportunity created by the climate crisis. You know, the Biden administration has, for instance, talked about how it's an opportunity to create new green jobs. But on the other hand, the sort of more radical movement for a Green New Deal has talked a lot about how there's an opportunity to create a better world and a more just world for people as we take on the climate crisis by, for instance, making it so that people have better access to things like public transit, which lowers emissions, but also can save people money and make their lives better. So how do you think about the sort of dichotomy between risk and opportunity? And are those two things, can they coexist? Are they opposed?
Well, I actually think that they're part of the same spectrum in a lot of ways. And I talk about in the book the ways that this growing sense of risk, a risk of climate shock and a risk of personally experiencing climate change will open up these windows of opportunity. And so there's research that I actually did, I learned all about this while I was sitting down the hall here at the Library of Congress. But there's a lot of research that talks about these moments after extreme events happen where people start to see opportunities. And the opportunities aren't just like, we have to go and clean up after the flood or whatever, but it's like, how do we make this more accessible, more equitable? How do we make our citizens' lives better? And so those opportunities, I think, are very much hand in hand with the risk. But I think the risk has to come first before these kinds of big ideas that are transformational have the capacity to be viable, which is unfortunate, but I just think that's what my research has shown.
Sure. I'm also curious how you're seeing movements move from the streets into halls of power. The book, for instance, chronicles the rise of the Sunrise Movement, which of course, very just blocks away from here, famously occupied Nancy Pelosi's office demanding a Green New Deal. Representative AOC joined them. And they went very quickly from sort of having that outside strategy to writing op-eds with John Podesta, who had been decried previously for being such a climate moderate, to helping sort of craft what became the Inflation Reduction Act, which was, I think, as you sort of chronicle, both a major win and a major betrayal. So how are you seeing movements sort of capture the energy that comes from the streets? And is something lost, I guess, in that process too?
Well, I think that any time that movements push towards and enter into positions of power, something's lost. Because it's all about compromise. And there have been some really interesting reflections on this from activists who turned into policymakers. Like, for example, the late John Lewis talked about this. And I think that when we look at the climate activists who have done this kind of work and have engaged with policymakers, mostly Democrats and mostly people involved in the Biden administration, the thing that I think is the big risk at this point is their feeling of betrayal that will lead them to walk away from participating and pushing and working through any of the levers, the political levers that are institutionalized in our democracy. Because at that point, well, we have to really wonder about what will come next. And I have to say that I just did this event up in New York where one of the young people who was on the panel with me specifically said that she and her friends are all telling everybody they know they shouldn't vote. And they shouldn't participate in our political process, which is terrifying to me because when people opt out of our political process, well, they still get a say, I suppose, but they're giving up their voices and they're giving up their opportunities to participate. And if they're still wanting to participate in the political process and are deciding to do it outside of the systems of power and all of the levers and all the institutions, that's when we can enter into a very dangerous period of time. And so, everybody else on the panel tried very hard to explain why you really should not give up your opportunity to vote because it's a very, very important right that we have. But I'm not sure that we're going to see it. And I think that there's some really interesting questions to be had. We have some young people who are still trying to get Podesta to push forward and maybe declare a climate emergency, which I'm very skeptical is going to happen. And then at the same time, we have other ones who are saying, we're not voting and we're not talking and we're not interested.
I want questions to come in from online. We will be going to those as well as questions in the room. One last question as we gather those and as everyone gets ready to ask. The subtitle just simply says from climate shocks to climate action. I mentioned at the beginning, and I think you've already hinted at a sense of optimism that can come as things get worse. There's an opportunity for things to get better, is your terminology. Are we seeing the shocks? I think we are. You've already described a warm February, but more importantly, are we seeing the kinds of responses that you expected to see? What do you expect to see in 2024 and 2025, the very near horizon? What do you anticipate? anticipate?
Well, I would just say that a warm February, while it is evidence of climate change, that's not a climate shock. I think if we think about what happened in Pakistan last year, what's happened with these atmospheric rivers, what's happened with these tornadoes that are destroying communities, those are climate shocks. And the hurricane season that they're already predicting is coming because of the warmed waters, that's where we'll see shocks, which tend to be devastating and tend to have quite a bit of effect on, have an effect on lives lost, right? It's that level of shock where I expect we'll actually see the type of systemic action that we need. For now, though, I think that there's a lot of talk about how the waters have warmed and how it's warmer out, we don't have winters. I mean, there's been a lot of stories about that. NPR did a whole story this morning about it. But there hasn't been a lot of action. There's just a lot of talk about it. And I think that that's really a challenge right now because the longer people talk about it, in some ways we become inured to it. But at the same time, it's only when, and this is what the research shows, which is why I say from climate shocks to climate action, it's only when we personally experience the shock, the extreme event that displace our, members of our family, which, harms people we know, that's when we're going to start to push for the type of climate action that's needed.
Let's go to the online questions first, if we have any ready to go, and then be catching the eye of either Mike or Sophia for questions in the room. Mike?
One question from the online audience. How do you compare the climate movement to other movements in recent decades, and what lessons would you take from their successes and failures that might inform climate activism?
Great. Well, I'm going to go back. I'll start with what we know from the civil rights movement, and we can move forward from there. Because there's actually a lot of consistency. But the three things that I think we learned from the civil rights movement that we actually have learned from more recent movements as well is, number one, is that activism that really pushes for systemic change is never popular, right? And the civil rights movement, a lot of people have this kind of shiny, happy perspective on what the civil rights movement is about. But for anybody who has that perspective, I suggest you read the recent book by a colleague of mine called,
The People's King?
Yes, The People's King, thank you. Sorry. Because it talks specifically about how Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement's memory was sanitized in its process becoming formally part of American history, and as MLK Day was formally accepted. And so we do not have this sense of how unpopular and how difficult the movement was. So that's number one. Number two is that I think that previous movements tell us that we really need to lean into what are called moral shocks, which are moments when we're surprised by the kind of action that's taken. And in the case of the civil rights movement, I talk about how those moral shocks were violence against the activists themselves. These were peaceful activists who were beaten up, they were terrorized by white supremacists, and it was the experience of seeing a lot of young black peaceful activists getting beaten up on television that mobilized many people to join the movement. More recently, we see a similar kind of thing happen with moral shocks after George Floyd was murdered. George Floyd's murder itself created this amazing moral shock because so many people watched him being an unarmed black man murdered on social media. But we also saw it with the protests afterwards when a bunch of peaceful protesters got tear gassed in Lafayette Park, not far from here. And after that happened, the protests grew. And that is this process where moral shock mobilizes sympathizers to take to the streets and join the movement. So those lessons start, we see it back in the civil rights movement, we can see it, and those strains run through to more recent movements and more recent examples.
Other questions? We'll go here.
Thank you very much for the talk. I had a question, just a couple of other aspects of climate activism that I've seen, and I wonder if you could tell us from your sociologist perspective sort of how you view them. So one is on the kind of more radical flank, the kind of blocking of pipeline projects, the efforts to sort of disrupt fossil fuel infrastructure, which the government has treated, sometimes using terrorism charges against those activists. And I wonder kind of with your sociologist hat, how you view that. And the other is the efforts to sort of undermine the social capital of the fossil fuel industry. So it's that, mapping of links to fossil fuel industries, the kind of shaming of entities that take fossil fuel monies or are otherwise linked to the fossil fuel industry. Again, as a sociologist, sort of how do you see that? Is this part of a bigger history? Thank you.
Sure. I mean, I would just say that what we see right now with the climate movement is it's a broadening ecosystem of movement actors, be they organizations, individuals who are working on different components of addressing the climate crisis, right? And so we have folks who are trying to shine light on fossil fuel interests and how embedded and entrenched they are in political systems. One of the other things they're doing right now that I think is fascinating, and I'm learning a lot from these activists, is there's efforts to pull fossil fuel interests out of funding research, right? A number of the most well-known environmental centers in this country are funded through huge amounts of money from fossil fuel interests or folks who are tied to fossil fuel companies. And one of the things that's interesting as somebody who's never actually worked in one of those institutes is that we see some very, very substantial differences in the kinds of research that come out of them, just in terms of the research questions they ask and the ways that they frame and interpret their findings. So I think that those all are extremely necessary. I mean, a lot of times people have talked about how we need an all-of-the-above energy strategy to address climate change, which is not true in my opinion, because it's not really working to address climate change at all. It is exacerbating climate change. But what we do need is an all-of-the-above activism strategy where we recognize and support and encourage all forms of activism. That can be people who are being, who are working through litigation, who are working on divesting on campuses, who are working to get fossil fuel money out of campuses, who are then also targeting fossil fuel infrastructure. I think that these draconian measures that are being taken against climate activists around the world right now are a very common strategy that countries and states take to push back when they start to feel that their legitimacy is being challenged. It is punitive and it is an intentional tactic that institutional actors take to try to shut down activism because they try to scare activists. They jail them, they fine them, they shut down organizations that are coordinating the activism. What I can tell you from my research on the radical flank is that, one of the things that I've done is I've surveyed activists involved and identify what organizations are involved and then use social network analysis to map this out to see what the kind of landscape is there. One of the things that we find when we do that is that, first of all, many activists are connected to multiple organizations simultaneously. And there's no central node in terms of an activist. There's no one charismatic leader who's leading all of this activism. And that's a very hopeful point because while we should absolutely expect to see more efforts by the state and by others to shut down climate activists, knowing that there is this distributed movement and distributed network of activists and individuals means that if you shut down one organization and you imprison one activist, that's not really going to affect the movement. The movement's going to continue to grow and continue to thrive. So perhaps there's an issue that actually needs to be addressed instead.
I see a question to my right.
I read your book and found the research fascinating. My question, because I first associated the climate movement with young people and young girls in particular, but have more recently gotten involved with Third Act, and I noticed there's a lot of older people in the room. So Third Act, which now has, I think, 65,000 followers, had this LNG permit protest that was going to take place at the Department of Energy. And I was following, I even signed up to be arrested for the first time in my life, if necessary. And I was following all these people coming in from all over America, from Seattle and LA and Canada. And the success of this protest was that it didn't happen, that Biden instead decided to at least delay the permits. And so I'm wondering about how you would, that's not something that you have in your book because it just happened so recently, but what your thoughts are on the success of a protest that didn't take place and that is taking credit for getting Biden to make that decision and the Department of Energy.
Thank you for the question. So I think that the LNG pause is a really interesting case study because the pause, which is basically a pause on continuing to build out this, this facility to be able to export additional natural gas, right? But it also expands to other, new builds for exporting natural gas. The things that are worth noting here, though, is the United States is the #1 exporter of natural gas, and this does not affect anything that's being exported right now, only new builds. The pause is an interesting tactic, but my interpretation is that it is very much to get everybody to settle down and vote for Biden. And I am skeptical that we are going to see that temporary pause, which is not formalized, is going to become a formal decision after the election is over in 2025. So instead, I think that it was really an effort to get young people to stop bird dogging at Biden administration events and to get a lot of older people who were planning on getting arrested out by the DOE to stand down. And it worked. The problem, though, is, this is exactly why I think that the Big Green should have never endorsed the administration early on, because this pause was because the administration is paying attention to what climate activists are doing. Think of the power. This is the moment of power, though. Once the election's over, the power is really gone. And so the idea that you just say, we endorse you, whatever you do, is really problematic. Instead, what I believe is that this is a great first step. And I know folks from Sunrise and folks from some other groups are starting to push back and say, this was a great first step, let's move forward with it. I know the Center for Biological Diversity is also talking about that, but I think that's really the way to go, is to see this as this opportunity. The reason that Joe Biden took on such an aggressive climate policy back in 2000 during the election was because he wanted to get the support of all the people who were supporting Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, who had very aggressive climate policies. And he basically did that to get Sunrise and the other people on his team. And he did, and they went out and they canvassed and they helped and they brought youth out and other people to vote, and it worked. And so they're trying to do that again, but I would say, let's try to see if we can see some real formal outcomes that can be carried through after the election, not just some symbolic statements that could be canceled the day after the election, which is what we've got right now.
Sophia, on my left.
Hi, well, thank you both for being here. My question is, I'm sure you are familiar with the IPCC's representative concentration pathways, the RCPs, which are different scenarios that show what the global average temperature will be like if we don't do anything to if we do as much as we can. And they don't really differ until 4 to 5 decades from now, so that's not something that will impact my lifetime, but generations to come. So my question is, how bad does the damage have to get before we actually make change? And is that damage going to be reversible or irreversible? And will it provoke a sense of doom or a sense of helplessness, especially in developing countries?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. How bad does it have to get before we really see the kinds of changes that are needed? And the answer, I think, I've had a bunch of conversations with movement leaders recently about this exact question because, right now, Tuvalu is basically moving everybody out and trying to figure out, find homes for all the people there because the country will be gone soon. And that's happening all over the world. We have a number of small island states that are disappearing. We have a number of developing countries that are becoming uninhabitable because of, they're being beyond the niche where it's livable without air conditioning, or they're having, food scarcity, water scarcity, et cetera, which is going to also trigger a whole bunch more migration, which, we're as a world doing just so well with as it is already. So the question, I don't have an answer for you that the number is 5. We don't know how many people it's going to take. What I do say in the book is that the sooner people recognize that we can't just keep waiting for decision makers and the climate regime that's going to be holding another meeting in a petrostate this year to save us, the sooner we can start to push for the kinds of changes that are necessary. The question is how much bad has to happen before we see this critical mass rise up and start to demand some sort of equitable transitions. And that's where that's why I'm an apocalyptic optimist, because I do think we're going to have to get closer to what those models say is going to come. But there are also a number of scholars who I worked with on the IPCC who are talking about the cascading effects and how we may be getting there a lot closer than they expected originally because of so many different things happening simultaneously here. So that the warming is way higher than anybody expected this year. And I know it's an El Nino, but we really don't know. We're completely in uncharted territory. One of the things I talk about in the beginning of the book is that, I'm a social scientist. This is the first time I've ever been prescriptive in my writing. What I've historically done is I tell you what I've found based on my research, and then I say, these are things I think about, and I'm going to go back and do more research. And all of those models from the IPCC basically build on history, and then they project forward, right? And so I tried to project forward about what it's going to take society to do to get where we need to go in the book, but we don't know the answer. And that's the problem. We don't know, and we need to recognize all the different things that have to go into our models and understanding to predict something that's reasonable. What I do know for sure is that we're not all going to get to the other side. And yes, some people are going to be so depressed and feel the effects so badly that it's going to cause, serious problems for them and serious problems for certain societies. But humans are resilient, and humans will figure out a way to survive. And what I really hope is that movements make it that it's not just going to be, the millionaires and billionaires who figure it out so that they can survive and move beyond.
So we have time for one more question. It's going to come from the online audience. What are the best contributions cultural and educational institutions can make in this fight?
Oh, I like that question. Thank you for that question. So the best contributions that cultural and educational institutions can make. So in the book at the end, I prescribe, right, which I don't usually do, and I have 3 suggestions. 2 of the suggestions are for the climate movement, about how the climate movement can be more effective. And I'll leave that for anybody who's interested. Just check out the book. But the last one is about cultivating resilience. And that's not just for the movement, but that's just for everybody, for us to understand and think through resilience. And I don't just mean environmental resilience, which is like figuring out how you can withstand more extreme weather and more severe storms or more flooding, right? So that's making your locality more resilient in that way. But it's also about social resilience, making your community more capable of handling these shocks that are going to affect everybody in different ways in your community, where people will likely be unhoused and people will be needing to rebuild, and making it so that there's capacity there. And when we think about that, there are these amazing opportunities for cultural and educational institutions that work at the local levels to start to build up and help to support community resilience. And I mean environmental and social resilience. And I do hope that they'll be able to start to fill the gaps that exist right now in communities across America and around the world. One of the places that I'm really looking and I'm really hopeful about is the role that libraries can play, but also, educational institutions of all sorts.
We've been discussing Dana Fisher's book, out just this month from Columbia University Press, Saving Ourselves from Climate Shocks to Climate Action. We were joined not just by the author, but also by Darna Noor from The Guardian. Please join me in thanking them for this great conversation.
Thank you.